Get started. It's a pleasure to be here to speak to you all. Thank you so much for coming. Yes, so I'm going to be talking to you basically about the sort of story behind my book, but if you have seen me talk about the subject before, there's going to be a few extra bits and pieces in here because I'm going to bring in some of our sort of Scottish fossils into the story and show how they slot in nicely to basically the story of mammal origins and evolution. And I should point out that throughout the talk, you're going to see these beautiful black and white illustrations by April Neander, who illustrated the book. So watch out for those. So first of all, I'll introduce myself. For those who don't know me, I'm a paleontologist from the Highlands of Scotland. I'm currently a researcher at the Oxford University Museum of Natural History, but I'm also an associate researcher at National Museum Scotland, and I'm a trustee of the Scottish Geology Trust. So the Museum of Natural History in Oxford has, well, incredible collections. As you would expect, it's a very old institution. So even though it's quite modest in size, we have over 7 million objects, including some really sort of key items like the only surviving soft tissue from the dodo, the extinct dodo. We also have the first dinosaur fossils that were ever described by Western scientists. They belong to Megalosaurus. But what you might not know is we also have the first mammal fossils described from the time of dinosaurs. Animals like Amphitherium, these little jaws that were actually found in the same rocks as these first dinosaurs. And they come from the Jurassic. And that's the time period that I'm particularly interested in. So this is part of the reason that I'm based there. So I study extinct life, but I specialize in the evolution of mammals. And much of my work is based on the Isle of Skye, or in the fossils from the Isle of Skye, where my team and I do fieldwork. And they come from the same time period as the collections in Oxford. So this is why I'm there. It's a sort of ability, I can compare specimens and so on. So most of the stuff that we find on Skye that we're interested in is very, very small. This site it was discovered in the 1970s by Mike Waldman and has been looked at ever since. But a lot of people, of course, are interested in things like dinosaurs and dinosaur footprints. But what we have at the site that we work on are these very, very small creatures. We've got dinosaurs too, but we also have some really early mammals, reptiles, little reptiles, lizard things, salamanders, stuff like that. So they give us this really complete picture of the ecosystem in the Middle Jurassic. So the animals I'm interested in particularly are those mammals. They're about the size at this time, about the size of a mouse or a rat, although I should point out that they are not rodents because rodents don't appear until much later on in time. And I use ultra high resolution CT and synchrotron X-rays to study these fossils, which gets around the problem of their small size. And it also allows us to do reconstructions like this. And this is from a paper that came out earlier this year. And it looks like a photograph, but it's actually not. This is a digital reconstruction of two skulls based on this partial skulls that we found on the island. So this is what they may have looked like I was going to say in life, but obviously if they've got no flesh in them, they weren't alive. But you know what I mean. This is what the original skeletons might have looked like. And these are some of the most complete fossils from the time of dinosaurs of mammals known in the UK, and some of the most complete in the world. Anyway, I've got to stop talking about those because what I'm supposed to be talking about is my book that came out earlier this year, Beasts Before Us. And this is a selection of photographs that people have been sending me of them reading it in various places around the world. And thank you so much to everyone who sent me those. Now, this tale is the tale of mammal origins and evolution. And it's something that you might think that you know parts of as a story, but I'm willing to bet that a lot of you haven't actually heard the whole story before. So what I want to do today is tell you the real origin story and how the characteristics that we associate with mammals first appeared much further back in time than you might suspect. So before we go on, it's worth outlining what a mammal is. I'm sure that you all know, but of course, mammals include ourselves and everything from bats to kangaroos to corgis to sengies to whales and dolphins. We live in the age of mammals. And the reason that it's called that is not because there are the most species, because there actually aren't. There's more species of fish and reptiles, but because they occupy the widest range of ecological niches, so they're doing the most interesting stuff, as it were, and also they have the biggest range of body size, everything from the tiniest shrews up to the blue whale. And if I was with you as a live audience, and I was to ask you what makes a mammal, I suspect that one of the first things that one of you would say would be that mammals produce milk. And this is true. This is one of our defining features as mammals, is that we have mammary glands and feed our young on milk. Another thing that I suspect you would say would be that we have hair or fur. Some of us have more hair and fur than others, as this beautiful, dashing horse demonstrates. But yeah, we all possess fur, and those mammals that no longer have fur, that's secondarily lost. So even, in fact, whales and dolphins, very early in their growth, sometimes have little whiskers left over that fall out as they grow. So yes, we all come from hairy ancestors. Another feature that you might not know about is actually our ear bones. So mammals, unlike all other tetrapods, so four-limbed animals, have 3 bones in the middle ear rather than just 1. And I'm going to come back to this later and what it means for our hearing capabilities, but it's one of our defining features. So mammals today fall into 3 main groups, and there's a suite of things that define each of these groups. But one of the most sort of easy to pick apart is the way in which we reproduce and give birth and bring up our young. So all of the mammals highlighted here are placental mammals. That includes ourselves, named, of course, for the placenta. And we, of course, retain our young inside until they are reasonably well developed by comparison, as we'll come to in a moment, before we give birth to them. And then, of course, we rear them on milk until they're independent. So humans are included in that group. Now, there's a lot fewer marsupials, the second group. There are way more placental mammals than there are marsupials. There's still a healthy smattering, though. And they also give birth to live young, like we do. But they give birth to them at a very, very underdeveloped stage. And these young are basically, they make their way, they actually pull themselves towards a teat, and they complete their earliest stages of growth in a pouch. And then once they are, of course, able to leave, they begin to leave the pouch and become independent. So the similar kind of thing, except one of them is being born a lot earlier, basically, in their growth than the other. The third group, though, they're the radical guys. They're the really cool ones. This is the monotremes. And this is the platypus, and then there's a few species of echidna. And they are the only representatives left of the group, the monotreme group. They used to be much more widespread, but these are the only ones left. As many of you will know, they lay eggs. This is a cast of one of their eggs in the National Museum in Scotland. And these tiny little eggs hatch into little puggles like these, which once again are brought up on milk, a defining mammal feature. And of course, laying eggs is the sort of the original trait. Giving birth to live young comes much later on. So this is what mammals are. So where do they come from? Let's get to the story. Well, our story ends here. That's right. This is not the beginning. This is the end. This is 66 million years ago at the end of the Cretaceous, when an asteroid was passing through our solar system, and it could have hit anywhere on any planet, but it smashed into the Earth, into what is now Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula. And very famously, this caused the mass extinction not only of the non-bird dinosaurs, but also the marine and flying reptiles and many types of mammal. And it brought an end to the Mesozoic period. So for most people and in most books that are written about mammal evolution, this is just where the story begins. But not in this tale. I'm going to tell you the true story. And the real beginning of the mammal tale goes back 250 million years before this point, before there were dinosaurs, before there were mammals as we know them, before there were even flowers, or pine trees, or beetles. Because I was quite shocked to discover that our mammal tree, when you really extend it right back in time, we're just this tiny little bit at the very end there. You can see the Cenozoic on the far right-hand side highlighted in orange. And I was very surprised as a student to discover that we can trace our lineage all the way back to the Carboniferous. So welcome to the Carboniferous. Uh-oh, okay, something went wrong with my slide there. Just ignore that bit about our geopark on the side and pretend that's not there, and I'll tell you when it's going to magically appear, okay? So the Carboniferous is over 320 million years ago. And this is a time when the whole planet was covered in these dense tropical swamp forests. Now these forests, the trees were not trees as we know them now because they had not evolved yet. They're actually the relatives of club mosses and quillworts, plants like lepidodendron and stigmaria. Now, if you've ever been to Fossil Grove in Glasgow, you'll have seen some examples of these trees. That basically dates from this time period. They have this amazing sort of plucked chicken skin bark. So yes, I do recommend that you go there and take a look. Now, also in the Carboniferous, we begin to see this climbing in atmospheric oxygen until it reaches the highest levels that have ever been known in the history of our planet. And they made it possible for insects to grow incredibly large. So we had, for example, dragonflies the size of seagulls, and we also had, and I would press the button and it would magically appear if I'd got my slides correct, the trackways of giant millipedes, some as large as motorbikes. And you can see some of these millipede tracks in places like Arran Geopark, I think also in Crail in Fife. Now, is my next slide actually going to work? Yay, okay, great. I'm glad I only made one mistake so far. So what are these creatures that we see down here in the foreground of our scene? Well, living alongside these giant insects, we have some of the first tetrapods. Now, what is a tetrapod? It's worth mentioning this in order to get our kind of story straight here. You might have been told that these are early amphibians or reptiles, and you might think that I'm about to tell you that they're mammals, but it's very important that we recognize that early tetrapods are none of the above, because all of those groups, they come much later in the story. They all evolved from tetrapods, and they're still tetrapods, they belong to that bigger group. But at this point in our story, in the Carboniferous, these creatures don't belong to any of those groups yet. But that's what we're just about to talk about. And they had, of course, evolved from lobe-finned fishes. And I said I would bring in some Scottish fossils. So let's have a little look at some fossils of these kind of transitional animals. Here are the fossils of Echinorphiton, which were found at Scat Craig in Moray, and they date to around 375 million years ago. So we're going back a bit further into the Devonian. And these incredible fossils are actually on view, on sale. You can go and view them at the moment in an amazing exhibition that's taking place at the Elgin Museum, which is all about Echinorphiton. And it's been made possible by loaning these different specimens from National Museum Scotland, BGS, OUM&H, where I'm based. So yes, check out this exhibition. It's on until the end of October, and find out more about these creatures that we evolved from. So anyway, on to tetrapods. And we at this point in the Carboniferous begin to see them split into the different main groups that we're going to talk about today. And the first ones to break away from the rest are the anamniotes. So they are the ones that do not have an amnion, and I'll come back to what that is in just a second. So one of the easiest ways to recognize an anamniote is that they lay their eggs with no protective shell. So here's frog spawn, for example. But this means that, of course, they are tied to the water because their eggs will dry out if they were to be laid out of water in any way. So they're very much tied to the water's edge. Now, this is still a very successful way of life because we still have frogs, salamanders, newts around today. But there is an innovation that comes slightly later on in the story, and that is the amniote tetrapods. They basically created their own portable pond because they put their eggs inside this tough outer shell, and that keeps all the moisture inside. And the membranes inside, one of the membranes inside an egg is called the amnion, and that's where the name amniote tetrapods comes from. And this gave them this advantage that they could move away from the water's edge. They could lay their eggs in places other than streams and rivers and ponds. So this meant later, when the climate began to change, they did have a bit of an advantage against the anamniotes and proliferate as a result. So amniote tetrapods, we've got one more split to talk about before we can kind of hit the mammal highway and get talking about mammals' earliest ancestors. At this point, back in the Carboniferous, these amniote tetrapods split into two groups. And we call them the synapsids and the diapsids. Don't worry too much about the terminology, but the main difference between them is at the back of the skull there. You can see shaded in blue. In the diapsids, they had two holes in the back of the skull behind the eye, and in the synapsids, only one. And these two lineages essentially are the ones that eventually include mammals on the one hand and reptiles on the other. Now, I should say that the story for reptiles is actually a bit more complicated than this, because some of them actually have no holes, or they possibly only have one, and yet then it's secretly two because there's another hole somewhere else. It's all very sort of mishmash. So there's a lot of arguments about the earliest reptile line. However, the synapsids that we're interested in today, it is pretty much set in stone that we know that they definitely had this one single hole. So they are, from the very beginning, they are their own lineage. And this is the lineage that we belong to today still. So what did these creatures look like all the way back in the Carboniferous? Well, perhaps a little bit like this. This is Echinorphiton, reconstruction of Echinorphiton from Joggins in Nova Scotia. And an awful lot of these very early amniote tetrapods are actually found at Joggins, which I believe is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. In the background there, you can see one of the outcrops at Joggins with a really beautiful lycopsid tree trunk pushing right through the middle of it. And a lot of the fossils of these very early synapsids and diapsids and so on have actually been found inside, curled up inside hollow tree trunks, where they perhaps were sleeping or hunting. So a really incredible sight. So that's the beginning of our story. Now, let's move forward a little bit into the latest Carboniferous and into the early Permian. Now, you might recognize this very handsome fellow here. This is Dicinodon. So we had, of course, this mammal line and this reptile line, their earliest ancestors, these tetrapods. They both appear in the Carboniferous, but it's actually our ancestors, the synapsid line, that really flourish and become large and take up the ecological space more quickly. This is their world, this is their time. And Dicinodon is one of these creatures. It's often accidentally thrown in with the dinosaurs, but existed long before dinosaurs did. And it is much more closely related to us. And it has this famous, beautiful sail on its back with these knitting needle bones that can hold it up. And we still don't entirely know what it's for, but the current thinking is that it is probably not used for thermal regulation, which used to be what people thought, and that is in fact more likely to be for display, perhaps to make themselves look intimidating to a rival. Now, so that's the beginning of the Permian. So I want to move now into the latter part of the Permian. And I actually first fell in love with the Permian when I was working at the quarry site called Clashach, which is in Elgin or near Elgin. And this is me standing on some boulders charting some of the footprints that come out of Clashach quarry, footprints like this one pictured in the foreground there. So Clashach has these amazing sandstones from the very latest part of the Permian. And at this time, all of the continents were pushed together in this supercontinent of Pangaea, which I'm sure you've all heard of. Now, the result of this configuration of the land masses is that most of the center of Pangaea was really hot and arid. So there was rainfall around the edges, but it was generally arid to desert-like conditions across certainly what was now Scotland, but also a lot of North America and the rest of Europe too. And traversing these sand dunes were some of our most ancient relatives. Here's another picture of, you can see the footprints on the one side and then a sort of heat map of those prints to make them slightly clearer beside it. And they come from a similarly aged site near Dumfries. And these are actually some of the earliest fossil footprints from this time period studied by science. And they belong to creatures like these. These are some of the fossils that have been found from Clashach quarry. And they're held, many of them are held in Elgin Museum again, but also in National Museum Scotland and the NHM in London and a few other places. And they don't look much like us, but I assure you, these are relatives of ours, these incredible creatures such as Gordonia and Geikia. Recently, some of these have actually been re-examined and a few of them have been reclassified as a genus called Dicinodon. And Dicinodon actually gives its name to this entire group of animals. They're called Dicinodons. I'll return to them in a moment. But if you want to see some of the amazing fossils from Clashach, again, go to Elgin Museum and check them out. So here are some of the creatures that would have been living alongside Geikia and Gordonia back in the Permian over 252 million years ago. And some of them grew absolutely enormous. You've got a cow and a cat there to give you some idea of scale. But the ones around the cow, these are some of the plant eaters that appeared at this time. Now, plant eating, dedicated plant eating, is actually a really difficult way of life, especially for big animals, because plants are incredibly hard to digest. So the fact that our ancestors, like Moschops here and Astemonosuchus, they had basically managed to figure out how, evolutionary-wise, figure out how to digest plants, potentially incorporating bacteria into their guts like modern herbivores do. But of course, where you get mega herbivores, you of course also get mega carnivores. So on the right-hand side, creatures like Gorgonops and Biarmasuchus, these are big, fast-moving predators. I should say some of these animals, they're 3 meters long from nose to tail tip. They're absolutely gigantic animals. So we basically have the beginning of a recognizable food web, you know, with apex predators, with big herbivores, and then in the bottom there you can also see we have some of the first climbing animals, some really competent digging animals. We have something that is becoming recognizably like a modern ecosystem. And all of this is almost entirely taking place among our own lineage, the synapsids. Now, most of these animals, we don't know much about what they look like. Some may have had whiskers. I'll come back to that in a second. They were likely to have been more warm-blooded, although not as warm-blooded as modern mammals are. But they were flourishing in these really early ecosystems 100 million years before dinosaurs even appeared. And let's have a quick look at a couple of the real characters here. Astemonosuchus is just one of my favorites. This skull, this is actually a picture, oh, hang on, there we go, a picture of the cast of the skull of Astemonosuchus, which is in the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Canada, but the original's in the Paleontological Institute in Moscow. Now, Astemonosuchus was about 3 meters long, and as you can see, an extremely handsome creature. It looks like a firework has basically gone off in its skull. It's got these massive horns above its eyes and coming out of its cheeks, probably like horned and antlered animals today. It would have used them to perhaps look larger, look ferocious, compete with others. We don't, of course, exactly know. But one of the really interesting things about Astemonosuchus is one of its fossils is actually being preserved with the earliest fossil skin for the synapsid lineage. And now these creatures in the past used to be called mammal-like reptiles, although we now know, of course, they have nothing to do with reptiles, a totally separate lineage. But if you look at this skin, you can see that this is not scaly skin. It's not what you would expect from anything even remotely reptilian. They had glandular skin, even at this point. They're very much on our family tree and no other. Gorgonops is great. It gives its name to a whole lineage of Gorgonopsians, which are all big predatory animals, the kind of first tigers, basically, of the Permian. And many of them have these amazing saber teeth, which we generally associate with creatures like saber-toothed cats, which of course are much, much more recent animals. But here we are, this is the first time animals developed saber teeth for hunting. Now, we're not the direct descendants of any of these animals. In fact, our more direct ancestors were a little bit more, well, humble, shall we say. They're creatures like this. This is Procynopsuchus, which was about the size of a cat. It was the first of what are called the Cynodonts, and that's the group that we belong to. We are also Cynodonts. Now, I mentioned earlier that maybe some of these animals had possibly even fur. Oh, Frank, I think there we go. I could hear myself echoing. I was beginning to think I was going mad. So yes, I said that they might have fur and whiskers. Now, what is the evidence for that? Because as you can imagine, something like that, how do we possibly know? Well, amazingly, in Russia, there have been fossil coprolites, so that's fossil poo, feces, that have been found with what look like hairs inside them. This is a picture of one of those hairs. Now, it's controversial because some people argue that it could be a filament of fungi, something like that. But the structure does look quite hair-like. So yes, it's a bit controversial, but if this is a hair, it is a sign that even this far back in time, over 252 million years ago, our lineage already had started to have whiskers and potentially fur as well. So it's pushing back our idea of when mammals really first appear all the way into the Permian. Unfortunately, this paradise of our early ancestors was not to last. As many of you will know, at the end of the Permian, disaster struck. And in what is now Siberia in Russia, volcanoes began to erupt. Now, these volcanoes erupted on a scale that we have never seen, and touch some wood somewhere that we never do ever have to see anything like this, because they poured out over 3 million cubic tons of lava. It's estimated that they covered around about 7 million square kilometers beneath a thick, deadly blanket of rock. Now, this obviously was destructive enough on its own. It would have killed everything it touched. But what was far worse than that was the amount of ash and gas that these volcanoes would have erupted alongside that lava. Now, the ash would have cut out sunlight. If you think back to the Eyjafjallajökull, I think it's called, the Icelandic volcano that erupted a few years ago, imagine that just magnified by 100. It would have smothered our planet and killed off plant life by stopping photosynthesis. In turn, of course, that would have starved plant eaters and then the animals that fed on them. Now, as well as this, the volcanoes would have been releasing greenhouse gases like sulfur and carbon dioxide. And of course, we all know only too well, thanks to the current climate crisis, what happens when greenhouse gases are erupted too quickly into the atmosphere. So first, the sulfur, it combined with water vapor in the atmosphere to create acid rain. And this would have essentially kind of stripped the landscape, flowed into waterways and rivers, and of course, turned the seas acidic and killed, fossil reefs and marine life. Now, the carbon dioxide, it rose to the highest levels that are recorded in the whole of the history of life on Earth, the whole last half a billion years. It's actually been estimated that it caused the planet to become so hot that were you to dip your foot in the ocean at the equator at the end of the Permian, it would have been as hot as a bath, as your evening bubble bath. This was properly a brutal time for life. And around about 3/4, probably more, of all life on Earth was wiped out. So this is the biggest mass extinction, far greater than the mass extinction that killed off the dinosaurs, the non-bird dinosaurs. So of course, the result is that it wiped a lot of the planet clean. And the evolutionary clock was essentially restarted again for those that survived. Now, all of that diversity of our mammal ancestors that had flourished up to that point, most of it was gone. And it was the reptiles that would become the most prolific creatures for the next 180 million years. However, Not everything died, of course, immediately, otherwise we wouldn't be here to tell the tale. And one of the rare animals that did well in the immediate aftermath of this disaster was this creature here, Lystrosaurus, pictured in the foreground. And those are Dicinodons. So that's that kind of creature that I was mentioning earlier. And these creatures that thrive after an extinction event, they are known as disaster taxa. This just is a taxa being a group of organisms. And they tend to do extremely well in the immediate aftermath of disasters, but they don't necessarily do so well in the long term. And that is true of this creature, Lystrosaurus. For a time, virtually every tetrapod fossil you find is a species of Lystrosaurus. But after a few million years, of course, the balance begins to shift and ecosystems begin to recover, although it took quite a long time. I should say a few words about Dicinodons here. I find them particularly fascinating when you look at the skull, and this is the skull that was, it's a reconstruction of a void that was left in the rock at Clashach Quarry in Elgin. And Neil Clark and colleagues, they scanned this void in the rock and were able to reconstruct the skull that had once occupied that void, and here it is. And one of the crazy things about these Dicinodons is that they actually have a beak and tusks. I think it's the only time in the history of life that beaks and tusks go hand in hand. It's a bizarre combo. But the beak was excellent for snipping off vegetation, and the tusks were likely used, like tusks are today, as a sign of virility and also to fight with one another and also to defend themselves. And Dicinodons are really interesting because they appear in the Permian and they survive this disaster, and they do go on to live through the Triassic as well, until in fact we end up with the largest non-mammalian synapsid, so one of our relatives, the largest that's not a true mammal in our history, and that's this creature here called Lizwica, which was found in Poland, which comes from the very latest Triassic. So these guys basically left the best till last. This thing was the size of an elephant. So quite an impressive creature. But of course, the star of this story are these little guys here. These are the descendants of creatures like Procinosuchus. These are the Cynodonts. And they also made it through the Permian mass extinction, but they would never be quite the same again, of course. So in the Triassic, we actually have quite a lot of different types of Cynodont. And most of them are relatively small. None really get more than sort of the size of a dog. But they tell a really interesting story of that sort of transition from these predecessors, these creatures in the Permian, to things that we basically recognize as mammals. And one of the key features, the key animals in that story is this one here. This is a cynodont called Thoraxodon, and it's known particularly from sites in South Africa. Now, it's key to our understanding because its relatively complete fossils tell us about the appearance of two really important soft tissue characteristics, and that is milk and whiskers. Now, you might wonder, am I going to talk about more evidence like this from fossil poo and things like that? But no, this is the first time that we get really solid, concrete evidence for these changes in our lineage. Now, the evidence comes from their skulls. This is a scan of a Thoraxodon skull, which my colleague Julien Benoit and his colleagues worked on recently. Now, you can see the skull is semi-transparent, and inside it, that pink bit is what's called an infraorbital foramen. It's basically a hole in the skull that nerves and blood vessels can go through. And the green bit is the maxillary canal. Now, that's in all of our upper jaws, and it's where all the blood vessels and the nerves pass through the jaw in order to innervate our upper lips. Now, the reason this is significant is because if you have whiskers, and humans, of course, are a bit of an exception because we have kind of lost our whiskers, although some people do have longer whiskers than others. But for whiskered animals, you need to have a lot of innervation in order to be able to transmit the data that you get from using your whiskers for touch, basically, and in order to be able to twitch your whiskers when you're using them to feel around your environment. So if you have lots of blood vessels and nerves, you need to have a very complex maxillary canal. And as you can see here, Thoraxodon is one of the first of our lineage to have this really complex branching structure in their upper jaw, which tells us that they almost certainly had whiskers. And if they had whiskers, it's pretty certain that they would have had fur because they come from the same basic structures in the skin. So this is over 200 million years ago in the Triassic. But I also said that, that this creature could tell us about our ancestors producing milk. Now, the way that it does this is through a different structure. Now, this is the parietal eye. You'll have heard of this, the third eye that you find in amphibians and reptiles. Here it is in a bullfrog and a lizard from Madagascar. Now, this hole in the top of the skull is believed to help these animals to regulate their sort of internal rhythms, their circadian rhythms, and so on. Now, one of the defining features in mammals is that we don't have this hole in our skull anymore. It actually, at the base of what we consider to be mammals, we lose that feature. Now, some people, however, do still have their third eye, their parietal foramen. That's because, of course, it appears very early in growth when you're an embryo, but it closes up. And you're usually born without this hole in your head. But for some people, it's retained. It doesn't close. Now, in studies of mice that have this condition, that still have their third eye, it's been this lack of closing of this hole has been traced to something called a homeogene, which has been given the code MSX2. And this mutation in this particular gene basically leads to this hole not closing, but linked to that, it also, in these mice, leads to deficiencies in their hair follicle maintenance, and also failure to develop a large cerebellum, a large brain, and it also interferes with their ability to produce milk. And that tells us that all of these features are actually tied together in our genes. Now, Thoraxodon is one of the first animals in which this hole in their skull has closed. And we also know from the evidence I just told you about a moment ago that it had fur and whiskers. So we can basically infer that probably, almost certainly, in Thoraxodon, we're starting to see the emergence of the ability to produce milk because all of these features are tied together. So this is some of the earliest evidence, basically, for the fact that there would have been fur and some kind of milk production, some very basic milk production, even this far back in the Triassic. So we come to the end of the Triassic, and many of those slightly larger animals like Thoraxodon, they begin to disappear. And we're left with these little tiny creatures like the ones I talked about earlier that I study, that were the size of mice. And these creatures, we now know, we would have recognized them as mammals. And of course, they now live in this world that becomes dominated by reptiles, giant reptiles. And you might think that this makes them the losers at this point in the story. But actually, this is one of the key moments for mammals because it forges them into the creatures that we know today. So it's true that mammals in the late Triassic and into the Jurassic were mostly small, but it was not a relegation, it was an innovation. Now, being big is not actually any kind of measure of success. Even today, we have around 5,500 species of mammals on Earth. Now, over 80% of them are extremely small rodents or bats. Those are the two largest families of mammals we have. Now, we know that back in the late Triassic and early Jurassic, our mammal ancestors, they're tiny little creatures, they were also nocturnal. We know this because most mammals alive today are colorblind. We're one of the rare exceptions that we've reacquired color vision through mutations in our genes. And so the reason that they are colorblind is because they've actually lost the photoreceptors in their eyes and the genes that allow good color perception, which is daylight vision, basically. So it's believed that the reason that those genes are switched off is because their common ancestors back at this time in the late Triassic didn't need them. So they became switched off. They basically were nocturnal. So we all come from nocturnal ancestors. But also at this time, of course, their whiskers were becoming super sensitive to touch, because if you're nocturnal, this is a great way to feel your world. And they also developed super sense of smell. We know this because in the brains of mammals around this time, we begin to see an enlargement in the part of the brain that processes smell, the olfactory bulbs. And mammals are actually the smelliest of all the tetrapods. Of course, we use scent for communication and scent marking, things like that. Mammals are basically particularly smelly creatures. Now, the smallness of these animals, I said it was also important because it forged changes in their bodies. And one of the most important changes was in the jaw. Now, up until this point, the jaws of our ancestors, the Dicinodons, had multiple bones that made up the back of the jaw. And you can see there in that top jaw, they're coloured orange. And at this point, through the Jurassic, we begin to see those bones become smaller and smaller until eventually they are basically freed from the jaw entirely. And at this point, they become incorporated into the ear. Now, this ties to their small size because studies have shown, for example, a recent one by Lautenschlager et al., that because these animals were so small, it meant that they didn't have the same pressures on the jaw for chewing that were required for a bigger animal. That basically, the loading on the jaw is different. And it meant that these little bones at the back were no longer needed for either chewing or for making up the jaw joint between the jaw and the skull. So because they weren't needed, nature hates waste. So it thought, you know what, I'll use these, I'll put them in the ear. So the malleus is one of the bones from the back of the jaw. The incus is actually where that bone used to connect to our skulls. And then the stapes is the bone that all tetrapods have in their ear. And this is really significant for mammals because we have a really exceptionally enormous range of hearing capabilities. Everything from your really ultra high frequencies for bats and dolphins, right down to the lowest frequencies that can be heard by, for example, whales and elephants. So this is another super sense. Basically, mammals have all these amazing super senses. It's quite incredible. Now, a lot of this information comes from very scant fossil evidence. Mammals for a long time were only known from bits and pieces, mainly jaws and teeth. But in the last 20 years, we have now these exceptional fossils coming out of China. You can see here, complete body fossils that give us the entire skeleton. And this is really significant, not only because they're gorgeous, and they of course give us additional information, but also because it allows us to understand how these animals moved in their environment. What was their actual ecology and their locomotion? And it turns out that it is far more diverse than we ever thought. By analysing these new specimens and their hind and forelimbs that we now have access to, we begin to see that there are flying squirrel-like mammals in the time of dinosaurs. We have Jurassic moles. We've got climbers. We've even got some otter-like creatures that are preserved with webbed feet and broadened tails that allow them to paddle through water. So basically, mammals in the time of dinosaurs, for a while they were small, but very quickly they branch out and become this incredibly diverse range of creatures that are really occupying almost all the same habitats that mammals of a similar body size do today. And all of this in the time of dinosaurs. Now, I couldn't move on without mentioning one of my absolute favorites, and it's this creature here. This is the skeleton of Rhipenomammus. Now, Rhipenomammus really turns the tables on our understanding of mammals and dinosaurs. So it comes from the early Cretaceous, and it belongs to this group that basically are the carnivores of, or the mammal carnivores of the Cretaceous. And here in the middle of the skeleton, there's this blob of bones. And this is actually the stomach contents of this creature. And when scientists began to look more closely at the bones that were in the stomach of this mammal, they discovered that they belonged to baby dinosaurs. So here was a mammal that was around about the size of a fox. Some of these creatures grew much larger, like more like badger-sized, and it was eating baby dinosaurs. So it really turns our whole idea of food webs on their head. It's really quite an exciting discovery. And of course, this is where the creatures that I study come into the picture again. We are finding many of these partial skeletons that, like the fossils in China, they include not only skulls. So here you can see from the paper that came out earlier this year, the 2 skulls that we described, but also we have a paper that's about to come out which describes the rest of the skeleton, which belongs to these 2 skulls you saw earlier on in the picture. And we have multiple bones from different parts of the body, and we're able to do the kind of analyses I was just talking about, where we can understand more about how these animals moved and lived in their environment. Frank, you can mute yourself again.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. So the final bit of the mammal story in the time of dinosaurs is this transformative moment, and not just for mammals, although obviously that's what I'll focus on, but for all life on Earth. And that's the appearance of the first flowering plants. And it really blows my mind to think that until this point, around about 100 million years ago, there were no flowers at all. They didn't exist. And at the start of the Cretaceous, we begin to see the first flowering plants basically take over the world. It's been dubbed the Cretaceous terrestrial revolution because the appearance of these flowers just so radically altered the ecosystems of our planet. Of course, they allow things like pollinators to appear. Of course, then we have fruits, we have nuts, we have seeds, basically the basis for entire new ecosystems. And now, I mean, if you look out your window, 9 times out of 10, if not more, every plant that you look at is going to be a flowering plant, what are called angiosperms. And it's significant for multiple animal and insect groups, but of course, very much for mammals. Here's a diagram from a study a couple of years ago. And the big band of grey down the centre there is marking the Cretaceous terrestrial revolution, where plants appear. And you can see that for mammals, immediately after that moment, we see this explosion in the numbers of different types of mammals from every branch of the mammal tree. So mammals are flower powered, as is our modern world. Now, I should mention what our direct ancestors were up to at this point. Here's an example of a few of the animals that we believe belong to, well, I should say the lineage that we share with marsupials, because at this point in the story, we still have our common ancestors are the ones that we're looking at. So this is Eomaya and Cynoconodon and Juromaya from China. And the funny thing about our own more direct ancestors is that they actually were that kind of cliche, slightly boring mammal from the time of dinosaurs. Most of them were pretty small, possibly tree-dwelling. They weren't doing all those exciting things that I told you all the other mammals were doing. And this is particularly interesting, actually. Why is this? Well, in a recent study that myself and my colleagues did, we looked at the changes that we see in the bones and teeth of mammals in the time of dinosaurs, and then straight after the mass extinction that removed the non-bird dinosaurs. And by looking at the number of changes that we have in all of these mammals, we found this really interesting pattern. Now, don't worry too much about detail here, but the take-home message of this plot that we show is that our direct ancestors, which are pictured in blue, you can see that their line doesn't really get very high, and it begins to tail off and go flat on this diagram. And that's because they basically aren't doing much. There aren't that many changes in their body shape and in what they're capable of doing. Whereas we see lots of changes continuing to happen, and the line keeps going up for earlier branches of the mammal tree. So the conclusion that we draw from this is that basically it's competition among mammals that means that these earlier groups, they got there first. They were the ones that diversified. They did all these interesting things in their environment, and there was no space for our direct ancestors to try out those modes of life. Until one fateful day, 66 million years ago, when, of course, not only did the non-bird dinosaurs, not only were they wiped out, but many of those other mammal groups were also wiped out. So we often get this very dramatic Hollywood apocalypse story of this asteroid impact. But I'd like to ask you to imagine for a moment the asteroid impact from a mammal's point of view, especially a small burrowing mammal. So to this little animal, safe in it from the forest fires and the falling ash that's going on above it, that asteroid impact, you know, it might have been nothing more than a sort of strange rumble from the other side of the planet. You know, it could have been fast asleep, hibernating. And when it wakes up, you know, it can eat almost anything. When you're small, a lot of these creatures, you know, they're very adaptable, they're generalists. And of course, that includes the millions of dead bodies that are now on the planet above you. You can nibble on them, chew in the bones, eat the insects that are feasting on them. And also, you know, sudden climate changes, which of course this asteroid impact would have brought, they don't matter so much if you're an animal that lives underground, because you've got your own climate control. If you've got warm blood, a body covering of fur, then nuclear winter, it might not be as difficult to survive through. And you can also feed your young on milk. And this is really of key importance, because it means as long as you can scrape up enough food to feed yourself, you can still feed your young and raise new families and multiply. So many mammal groups did die out alongside the giant reptiles, but enough survived, as did many reptiles and particularly birds. But enough mammals survived that, and they, this time around, were the first ones to grow to large sizes. And they became, of course, the giant herbivores and carnivores and tree climbers and things that we know today. And it's basically, it's a cyclical process. First time round, it was our ancestors. After the Permian, it was the reptiles. Then after the Cretaceous, it was mammals again. So yes, it's a cyclical thing. And I'm not going to talk too much about what happens after this point, but it's worth having a little look at these sort of competing models for how modern mammals emerged. Here you can see a diagram that kind of sums up the sort of pattern we might have seen of mammals, modern mammals. And there's a lot of arguments. Different people believe in different patterns. Did they basically do absolutely nothing much at all until the impact, and then suddenly they exploded into all the diversity we know today? Or had they been multiplying for a long time and then a few of them were wiped out, but then they continued to multiply? Or something in between? Was it fast? Was it short? To be honest with you, it's unlikely that we'll ever conclusively be able to say exactly how and when our very most modern mammal lineages appeared, because the fossils and the DNA don't agree with each other. The first fossils appear after the mass extinction, which suggests that there was an explosive diversity afterwards. But the DNA says, no, it happened much earlier. So I think this is going to be an ongoing argument that will probably never be solved. But whatever the case, we now have this incredible diversity of mammals on our planet today. And I hope I've shown, though, in this talk that the features that make these creatures mammals have much, much longer roots, way back into not just the time of dinosaurs, but even before that, before the reptiles were even a twinkle in nature's eye. And with each mass extinction, it's basically a lottery as to who will be the most populous and ecologically diverse, afterwards. And as we currently are in this sixth mass extinction caused by human-induced climate change, it's interesting to wonder who the winners are going to be the next time that the evolutionary clock restarts. Only time will tell, and I'm certainly not going to be there to see what happens. So with that, I want to say thank you to everybody for coming, and to these wonderful people, particularly April, for her illustrations that are in this book. Yes, that's me done. Thank you so much for listening. And if you'd like to ask any questions, I'd be delighted to try and answer them.